Hello, everyone, and welcome to this sixth and final edition of the Russia's World series, and really one of the most exciting of the events we've had this year, I think. We're back after a little hiatus that was caused by Columbia's intransigence and unwillingness to offer a fair contract to its student workers and the strike that resulted from that. In this series, over the course of the year since October, we've looked at Russia and the Soviet Union in international and global context, with each event gathering different speakers on a particular part of the world, different states or parts of the international environment, and the Soviet Union and Russia's engagement with them. Before we start today, I just want to thank the Harriman and all of our presenters and attendees that have come to the workshop over the year, many of whom, including our presenters today, have sort of become regulars and have joined us for many of these events, and created a real sense of continuity in the discussions that we've had and the interests that we've been engaging with. I know that we've all had a lot of difficulties over the past year, but in this case, I think we've really benefited from the opportunities offered by Zoom, and it's been really an interesting series. So as usual today, in terms of format, we will have both presenters give their talks, and then we will have a discussion between the two of them, and then we will open things to a Q&A from the audience. And if you'd like to ask a question, please put it in the Q&A box at any time, and we will get to it in that section. So today we're joined by Michael David Fox, professor of history at Georgetown University. Many of his books have dealt with the Soviet Union's engagement and entanglement with the rest of the world, but two in particular stand out to me, showcasing the Great Experiment, Cultural Diplomacy and Western Visitors to the Soviet Union, 1921 to 1941, which was published in 2012 on Oxford University Press, which dealt with VOX, the All-Union Society for Cultural Relations Abroad, and also Crossing Borders, Modernity, Culture, and Ideology in Russia and the Soviet Union, which was published in 2015 on Pittsburgh University Press. Today, Professor David Fox will speak about his current project on the German occupation of the Soviet Union in the Second World War. Our second speaker today is Francine Hirsch, VLS Distinguished Achievement Professor of History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her verse book, Empire of Nations, Ethnographic Knowledge in the Making of the Soviet Union, which came out on Cornell University Press in 2005, also deals with international and transnational contexts of Soviet history, among many other things, showing the interrelationship between Soviet nationalities policy and British and French imperial policy and knowledge production in a relationship defined by both mimesis and opposition. And today, she'll be speaking about her new book, which just came out last year on Oxford University Press, Soviet Judgment at Nuremberg, A New History of the International Military Tribunal After World War II. So with that, I will turn things over to Professor David Fox, who will start off today.
Hello, everyone. So thank you, Sam, for that introduction. Thanks to Sam and Azat for the invitation. And congratulations also to you both for putting together such a successful speakers series and such an evocative title, Russia's Worlds. We don't often think of World War II on the Eastern Front as one of those worlds, as forming a world that the Soviet Union encountered, but think about the millions of Soviet citizens who had lived under Stalinism and experienced that, and then suddenly found themselves under Nazi German occupation for several years in the midst of this unprecedented war. I'm going to be drawing on my own book project, which is entitled Crucibles of Power, Smallansk under Nazi and Soviet Rule. And I'm focusing in that book basically on what was before the war Smallensk Oblast, the region. And I pick up in that book, which is forthcoming from, well, I would say it's under contract with Harvard. I still have a couple of chapters to write, but I'm written most of it. And it picks up basically with the onset of Stalinism in 1928 with the so-called Smallensk affair, which was sort of the rural equivalent of the Shachty trial, marking the onset of Stalinism. But the sort of Schwerpunkt of the book is the German occupation in World War II, which lasted between 1941 and 43. And the book ends with after re-Sovietization around 1944-45. So when I first conceived this book, which I have to admit was a decade ago, I was wont to do in those days. I was thinking in terms of vast impersonal forces, big issues, and historiography. And I was attracted to a topic that lies basically at the intersection of three fields: Soviet history, the history of the Eastern Front and Nazi Germany, and the Holocaust studies, which at that point was rather separate field. And it's still one of my major goals is to sort of cross-fertilize those three fields, Stalinism, Nazism, and the Holocaust. And the regional focus mediates between sort of the local and the central and three levels of power in a way that I hope will shed light on all three. But after a few years of research, I became increasingly interested in putting lives and biographies and biographical trajectories and autobiographical sources much closer to the center of the exploration. So the aim now is to try to explore how the micro affects the macro and vice versa, or as Catherine Yevtuhov put it, I think, very well, and when she was working on her book on Nizhny Novgorod in the 19th century, to aim at the place where the local meets the grand narrative. And my shift was due not only to the field's engagement increasingly with lived experience, but with a flood of new ego documents in the 2010s, including what I have to say is a stunning collection of 70 Smallensk interviews in the Minsk Commission archive, and that's the Academy of Sciences interview project that picked up as early as January 1942 and only became accessible a few years ago. So I'm trying to demonstrate how ego documents assume more significance when they're analyzed not in isolation, but in conjuncture with a much broader and deeper archival investigation. So at this point, let me share my screen, and I'm going to just show you a couple of images. And the first one is this rather, I may say, cockamamie map. There's a real lack of maps. I really, for this book project, have to get my own maps constructed. But the reason I've put this in is because here you see Smallensk, and you do not see the pre-war boundaries of Smallensk Oblast. But basically, Smallensk was in the eastern part of the Oblast, and it encompassed Vyazma. And what we really, the 38 borders also differed from several previous borders, and I won't get into the territorial aspects because they're not that crucial for this talk today, but basically to show that this is under the Wehrmacht, the Army Group Mitte administration, which has been much less studied, I think, in largely ethnically Russian area than either Belarus or Ukraine. And of course, the borders of Vice Ruthenian or the Nazis were rearranged in 42, but this is as of late 41. That is to say, the Battle of Smallensk was around August late summer of 1941, and then the German army paused, as you know, and then pushed towards Moscow and were repulsed in Operation Typhoon, were pushed back, and then several hundred kilometers were regained after the Battle of Moscow. And those borders essentially remains, the front line borders, so to speak, remain fairly stable for the better over 2 years. I mean, what you also see is huge encirclements. This is relevant, you know, in the early stages of the war, the huge encirclements of Red Army soldiers, many of whom escaped and then were able to join the partisan movement. So the partisans are going to be a big part of my talk today. Especially since Smalyansk and Bryansk were heavily forested areas, they were home to some of the largest partisan movements. And I should also say that fairly close to the former Pale of Settlement, this had a large, fairly significant Jewish population as well as other minorities, but is primarily ethnically Russian. Now, most studies of World War II do not seriously cross the 1941 divide. The two regime changes that I'm really paying a lot of attention to in Smalyansk in both 1941 and then again in 1943 blew the lid off twice, blew the off extremely violent and repressive regimes. And that, I think, makes it a kind of virtual laboratory for studying power relations, which is the central theme of my work, holding it together. German rule differed as I mentioned, from the eastern part of the former Smolensk Oblast to the western part differed, you know, in length, but in the east, at its longest, it lasted 27 months from summer of 41 on. The war generated not only massive numbers of victims, but power vacuums and this periods of bizvlastia, which are very interesting to me. The loss of the state's monopoly on violence, the devolution of decision-making to the local level, and the urgent need to reestablish or create viable forms of rule. And so it's the very uniqueness of that conjuncture that reveals much about people, their motivations, their loyalties. And so to study how power operated among people in concrete sites such as partisan encampments in the forests, POW camps, ghettos, the collaborationist city governance, that's one of my primary focuses. And today I want to explore two major themes of my work that I hope will put my project into dialogue with Franz. The first has to do with how biographies and autobiographies and behavior during the period of pre-war Stalinism deepen our understanding of lives after 1941 under German rule and vice versa. So we're able to analyze how people adapt to very different regimes of left and right. I will deal with this age-old comparison between Nazism and Stalinism, but I should say that I view both as violent, as in part utopian, but also as revolutionary. But with war triggering the most intensive period of radicalization in the Nazi revolution, they are at different stages in their life cycles as revolutions. And the second theme that I want to raise today is also very well worn in the literature. It's collaboration and resistance, but one that I hope to reconfigure in light of these biographical trajectories and focus on power relations. So I hope that my discussion of the interplay between these different levels of power, the discussion of biographical logics, and the discussion of individual agency will have broader resonance for many of you listening today. So the way I want to bring these themes across is to discuss figures, really two major figures who play significant roles in different chapters of my book. Let me start with the collaborationist mayor of the Burgomeister, as he was called by the Germans, of the city of Smalyansk, Boris Georgievich Menshagin. He had joined the Smalyansk Collegium of Defense Attorneys on the eve of the Great Terror. His father, he came from a rather dubious class background. His father had not only graduated from the St. Petersburg Faculty of Law in 1879, but his father was a seminary graduate and a member of the clergy, a parish clerk or diak who had worked as an ecclesiastical secretary in the course of his legal career. So Menshagin, the younger Boris Menshagin, was insulated from this dangerous class background in the 1920s by his 12 years of service in the Red Army, where he was an archivist or делопроизводитель. And I think ultimately he had a phenomenal memory, and ultimately he remained a kind of делопроизводитель his whole life. You'll see where I'm going with this. But he was religious. He remained religious throughout his life, and he was removed from the Red Army during a crackdown for attending church in 1929. But he was able to launch a legal career. He had attended law school in Moscow earlier, before the Civil War, and he launched a career as a defense attorney, which was around, well, between 1929 and 1941. In the 30s, he had hoped very much that the Stalin constitution would moderate the regime, and then he became bitterly disillusioned. And one reason we know so much about Menshagin is that he served 25 years in prison after the war. The memoirs and notebooks that he prepared in prison all those years were confiscated by his release, upon his release in 1972. But as I mentioned, he had a phenomenal memory. He reconstructed them at a dissident's dacha. He met some dissidents in prison in the 60s, and he was able to smuggle them out via these dissidents to Europe on video cassette in the early 1970s, where they were transcribed but never published. But here you see the front cover of the book that I was involved with for several years, which is over 900 pages, not only of his memoirs and notebooks and various documents, but of essays and other considerations of Menshagin. No collaborationist mayor that I know of under German occupation produced memoirs of any such significance. And why was he kept alive and not simply shot? Well, the fact that he had witnessed the German exhumation of graves at Katyn prompted the Soviets to keep him alive. His deputy, Basilevsky, testified at the Nuremberg Trials. Here's where my work perhaps intersects most directly with Franz. He refused, Basilevsky testified that Katyn had been a German atrocity. He was able to live his life out as an astronomer in Novosibirsk. Menshagin, on the other hand, refused to blame the Germans for Katyn, and he produced these memoirs that are extremely valuable. I've corroborated many of the sort of quote unquote facts in them with documentation. But as I interpret in the essay in this book, his strategy in his memoirs, they're one of selective silence. That's one thing. B, denial of direct involvement in atrocities. That's another. And C, or third, an overwhelming detailed facticity to make up for the first two elements on matters, especially of the functioning, the daily functioning of the Smallansk collaborationist uprava or governance in order to sort of enhance his credentials. Now, I should say that Menshagin was a member of the non-party professional intelligentsia. He, as I mentioned, was religious. He was a technocrat, not an ideologue, but in all matters great and small, and he sometimes published in the occupation newspaper on ideological matters. He outwardly subordinated himself to the German military authorities, but he also maneuvered behind the scenes. What I want to highlight here is a certain logic to Menshagin's life across the 1941 divide. The kinds of life and death situations that routinely enmeshed him in this period of 41, 43 are not unknown to us. They're common in histories of the Holocaust or many other episodes of political violence. But one thing that makes Menshagin's case so instructive is that it's much more than a wartime story. Menshagin lived a particularly Soviet life. And although he came to hate Stalinism, his entire experience was shaped by Soviet rule. For me, it's centrally important that both under Stalinism and Nazism, Menshagin portrayed himself as more moral, more cultured, and that's the word he uses, and more devoted to saving victims than the sort of backbiting opportunists he portrays all around him, as well as the brutal Germans. How someone who served the Nazis cultivated his self-presentation as a deeply moral altruist is, I think, itself a very interesting question. And it's true that as mayor, he was in fact, one step removed from many of the atrocities that the Soviets tried to implicate him in, as, for example, the local police, polizei, that helped liquidate the ghetto and fight the partisans and dealt with mass death at the POW camps, the gulags, were not under his direct command. And in fact, it's also true that his signature allowed numerous starving POWs to be released and registered in city administration jobs. So this is, I mentioned the large encirclements, and I did find documents in German that showed that this was not unique to Menshagin. All the mayors were able to sort of pick from the POW camps to staff a limited amount of people to staff, or more or less, to staff their city governances and play other roles as civilians. And so it was, looking at him unique as a sort of unique individual case, taking it out of the broader documentation makes it seem like he was different. But that was a sort of routine right that the mayors had. This is the big gulag or a POW camp in right outside of Smallansk. But I also found that Menshagin did play a really primary role in ghettoization, a secondary one in the liquidation of the ghetto. And the Smalyansk city ghetto was the longest lasting one in the entire area of the former Russian Federation. So he had to be on board with the security regime in the city, with German labor demands, with the anti-partisan war, et cetera. But he was, interestingly enough, if anything, philo-Semitic, as he had Jewish friends and colleagues in his legal career. He also saved some Jews as well as some Communist Party members. And he pushed back to the German authorities about food supply, especially during the near starvation conditions of winter 1942. I just couldn't resist putting this photo in. It doesn't really relate to my talk, except to show that Smolensk was really an armed military camp in the middle of this. It was on the road between the Magistral, between Minsk and Moscow. It was the headquarters for Einsatzgruppe B, one of the major pushes, pushing towards Moscow in 41, as well as a major military administration and economic center. So there were more German soldiers in Smolensk than civilians. And the city was reduced to something under 40,000 population. But Menshagin's wartime behavior, in fact, parallels in striking ways what he had done in the Stalinist 1930s. As a public defender during the terror, Menshagin had to outwardly conform even more studiously than under the German occupation. He played the role that the repressive regime required. And yet the local Smolensk show trials against wreckers that he played a role in and defended, played a role as public defender, were far less scripted than the Great Moscow trials. Many people repudiated their forced confessions. And in the most significant instance, Menshagin appealed to and traveled to Moscow to meet Vyshinsky in 1937 and stayed the execution of a number of veterinarians who had been accused, these were the rural show trials, of infecting livestock with brucellosis, the disease that they studied. And this was a highly unusual step in 1937. It involved a distinct risk, but one he approached, and this again, I've had to read his memoirs in conjunction with the archival record, but he sort of approached it with extreme caution and later exaggerated his role. And he did provoke the sort of anger of the local NKVD, which they did not forget after the war. But in terms of legal professionalism, he was also playing an obligatory role within the Soviet system that Vyshinsky had long championed. Vyshinsky was a key figure in the Stalinist project of investing in law as well as terror as mechanisms of social control and transformation. Fran, if you're listening, this is what is known in football as a lateral pass. So the Germans also needed professionals, and they typically recruited members of the local intelligentsia to serve in these civilian administrations. Menshagin justified serving Berlin in precisely the same moralistic terms that he devoted to serving Moscow, pointing to maneuvering that saved some of the victims. Under both systems, he held a public position of local prominence that required his professional skills. His priorities as mayor, as I've said, in all major matters, security and ideology and supplying the Wehrmacht, were set by the Germans. But within those parameters, he and other Russian mayors ruled the local populations and had room for maneuver. He was known as Nachalnik Goroda to the Russian population. This is Menshagin sitting and in 1942 with a Wehrmacht officer. You see the cutoff picture of Hitler, several members of the city administration. Smalyansk was the site of the Vlasov's Smolensk Declaration, in part because it held symbolic significance as an old Russian city to both the Soviets and the Germans. This is Menshagin after 25 years in prison, 10 of which he spent in solitary confinement. So partly in response to our book, I was one of the co-editors. Some Russians, but it goes back even further, the debate about him. But some Russians recently have sort of heroized Menshagin because of his anti-Stalinism, because of his actions to save some POWs and Jews. But to me, his behavior illustrates how even acts of mercy can unwittingly reveal a bigger horror. In September 1941, an elderly Jewish couple tried to escape resettlement in the new Smolensk ghetto by Russifying their names on forged identification papers. Menshagin, who then was the 39-year-old mayor, had been serving for less than a month when the two appeared in front of him. He was in charge in his office of registering the city population and of segregating the Jews into a ghetto and reallocating their property. After questioning the elderly couple, Menshagin rendered his decision. This is quoting from his memoirs, quote, "I liked them, so I signed both passports, stamped them, and gave them back to them, asking that they tell no one about this." So that little phrase, "I liked them," is worthy of reflection. After using his cross-examination techniques and his knowledge of the Soviet system to unmask many supplicants who were attempting to deceive him about their pasts, he sent all those he did not like or trust, quote, "to the four winds." Menshagin did not agonize over these decisions. He displayed only satisfaction in wielding his newly acquired power of life and death. And the last point on Menshagin is that he was able to provide jobs, housing, and access to canteens to the near-starving population for approximately 1/10 of the city population of the war years, who worked either for him directly or for one of the city's enterprises. So in subordinating himself to the Nazis, he rendered himself powerless to the point of abasement. By so doing, he acquired greater local power. Now, my next case, and I realize I'm running behind in time, so it's not going to be as long, but it's of another biographical trajectory. It's of Fyodor Danilovich Gnezdilova, who became the military commander of the 24th anniversary of the Red Army Regiment, one of the partisan movements that liberated the so-called Dargabush partisan territory, which was, you can see on this handmade map made by an NKVD agent right here in the middle of Smolensk Oblast. and this was connected with by a corridor to Yelnya, so the Yelnya Dorogobush Partizansky Krai, or partisan territory, was one of the major areas where Soviet power was restored by partisans in the middle of war on the Eastern Front. I would describe Gnezdilova as brutal, semi-literate, clever, brash. He was a longtime professional executioner who came from peasant stock, but he seized the opportunities offered by war to reinvent himself as a charismatic warlord. But his rise was predicated on his pre-war past. He had worked in counterinsurgency, as a matter of fact, when he turned 18 in 1916, joining the Tsar's troops to combat the insurrections that began in that year in Turkestan. During the Civil War, he fought with the Red Army against the Whites in the South, then returned after the revolution to, quote, I'm quoting from his Minsk Commission interview, to liquidate bands of rebels in the 1920s. He finished only one class of school. He was too illiterate to go to a party school, but he told the Minsk Commission rather proudly, 11 years I shot enemies of the people who were sentenced by our Soviet court. He went, as he put it, he went psycho, zapsychoval, in 1929, but was cured in a psychiatric institute after 6 months. He found work in the Department of Prisons in Moscow in the NKVD. He didn't say what he did for the NKVD between 33 and 37, but we know that in the Great Terror, he left both the NKVD and the party. He became a repairman of escalators for the metro, which skills that served him very well when his unit fixed up broken tanks during the war. So Gnezdilova's rise from executioner to commander raises this issue of what Geyer and Edele spoke about in Beyond Totalitarianism, of the cadres of violence who were prepared before the war. But not only that, what I would add is that it raises, like the case of Menshagin, the spectacle of new opportunities that were opened up by the war. And let me see how I'm doing on time here. Yes, I'm running out of time, but I want to just briefly touch on the liberation that if you see Fyodor Danilovich Gnezdilova formed a partisan unit called FD when in the early years of 41. That's his unit right here. He named it FD because it was not just his own initials, but it was also the initials of Felix Dzerzhinsky, so creating a bond between his own identity and that of the founder of the Cheka. And when these partisans recreated Soviet power in the midst of war, it raises the spectacle of what I call Stalinism without Stalin, behind enemy lines. And partisan units sort of camped out in the forests for long periods of time, formed a kind of pro-Soviet society in miniature. It's a microcosm. It had its own rulers, the commanders. It had a leadership elite drawn extensively, but not exclusively, from former party-stated cadres who could make the switch to wartime. It had a younger generation dominated by komsomols, a rank and file made up of fighters, and a marginalized underclass, including women, minorities, Jews, and others. The currency of this realm, this forest realm, was weapons, equipment, food, and moonshine. It favored not urban skills, as in the sort of pre-war Stalinist modernity, but fighting and rural skills. Gnezdilova exemplifies both how he rose up as a non-member of the elite to seize the moment to become a kind of charismatic warlord in the midst of war, but also that he was involved in this resurrection of Soviet power. And here I just want to briefly say that this is a fascinating and little-known phenomenon. what you had is that you had a kind of dual power, both the units and a civilian power structure that was restored, Rajkome and Raispolkome and so forth. And this, they had a massive purge, they had extensive connection to cadres, they resurrected a propaganda blitz, but even other elements of the Soviet system, a welfare system, including medical and educational institutions. And I won't go into the details of how the NKVD and some party members airlifted in from Moscow, mixed with the locals like Gnezdilova. But the point is that it was a kind of hybrid where the partisan phenomenon that had emerged during the war was kind of influenced by both the cadres who were sent from the center, but more importantly, Moscow was far away, but the worldview was not that far away. These people had been formed under Stalinism. So the attention to cadres and purges and resurrecting in the midst of war, starting to recollectivize agriculture, just as the Germans were promulgating their new law on land, which was not yet clear, promised, but never disbanded fully the collective farms. These were all, this is just a partisan newspaper handmade during the war. And you see in this lower article, they're listing, just like in pre-war factories, publicly shaming those who were shirking and publicly praising those who fought well. So to conclude, I want to make the point that the partisan war was an opportunity for Gnezdilova an opportunity of self-realization. And he peppered his interview with this Minsk Commission with boasts about his resoluteness in liquidating prisoners and marauders and Germans. And the first person singular underlines his newfound status. If I go on a nighttime raid, then I destroy 200, 300 Germans. So in conclusion, I'm just going to skip over some of my material on, if you want to ask me about how typical Gnezdilova was, the answer is that there were many surprising things within the partisan leadership, even though predominantly drawn from the former party state elite in the units that I was talking about that liberated that region in central Smallansk. But what I want to just conclude with is the notion that both Menshagin and Gnezdilova stand out as unusual. One is a very singular collaborator, and the other is a very singular Stalinist in this context. But they can both be understood through their trajectories across 1941, and also how they reinvented themselves in the midst of the wartime cataclysm as the world of Stalinism imploded into the world of the Eastern Front. Both figures have been subject to significant obfuscation and mythologization since the war, but that's another story, and I'm happy to turn it over to Fran.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay, fabulous. I'm gonna share my screen now, just so that I can get that out of the way. All right, you see me, you see the slides are all good? All right, wonderful, fabulous, okay. Let me just move this so that, okay, wonderful. All right, well, great. So this is really exciting to be here today and just a pleasure. I'd like to thank Sam and Azat and the Harriman Institute for this invitation to participate in this discussion. And yeah, Misha, we'll have a lot to talk about. I'm really excited. I actually didn't realize that we were both going to be talking about biographies, people's lives. So, there's just so much to think of. So today I'm actually going to be talking about three people who played critical roles for the Soviet Union on the international stage in the wake of World War II. And I'll just say that as I was putting together the talk for today, I was rereading a little bit of Vasily Grossman's Life and Fate. And again, just thinking about, again, that connection between Stalinism and Nazism, that trajectory of what it was like to to grow up in the Soviet Union, to have those experiences under Stalinism, and then to experience the war and what happened after the war. So, so again, really lots in common. But the three people I'll be talking about are, number one, the criminologist turned international law expert, Aron Trainin, the playwright and war correspondent, Vsevolod Vishnevsky, who's in this slide here in front of the Grand Hotel in Nuremberg, and he's second from the left, with some other Soviet correspondents and a US guard, and the prosecutor, Roman Rudenko. I became fascinated by Trainin, Vishnevsky, and Rudenko while researching and writing my book, Soviet Judgment at Nuremberg. So in this book, which came out last July, I used documents from the former Soviet archives to take a fresh look at the Nuremberg trials and at the Soviet Union's unexpected contribution to international law. The book focuses on the International Military Tribunal, or IMT, the first of the Nuremberg trials, which took place from November 1945 to October 1946 at the Palace of Justice in occupied Germany. And here we have the Palace of Justice and a map of occupied Germany. The Palace of Justice was in the American zone in Nuremberg. I'm pointing to my screen as if you could see my finger, but it's where the star is on there. It's where the star is. The Soviet Union, the United States, Great Britain, and France tried 22 former Nazi leaders, including Hermann Goering and Joachim von Ribbentrop, and here they are in the dock, and they tried them for conspiracy, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. I argue in the book that the Soviets significantly shaped the IMT, that they significantly shaped the Nuremberg trials, and that without them, Nuremberg likely would not have happened. I also argue that the Soviets were greatly handicapped on the international stage in Nuremberg and beyond by the constraints of Stalinism. Soviet judgment at Nuremberg is about politics and law and diplomacy, but it's also about people. The members of the Soviet delegation, the lawyers, the judges, the interpreters, the drivers, the secret police agents, and the correspondents who are in the front row here at a soccer match, they're central to the story. Trainin, Vishnevsky, and Rudenko had particularly interesting and important roles. And today what I'll do in my time is I'll give you snapshots of their lives centered around several questions. First, what roles did they play as intermediaries between the Soviet Union and the wider world at Nuremberg and more generally? Next, why were they selected for the Soviet delegation at Nuremberg? And what did they bring with them to Nuremberg in terms of life experience, know-how, and expectations? Finally, what happened to them after Nuremberg? And then I'll ask you to join me in thinking about what their lives and fates can tell us about the Soviet Union and its relationship to the wider world under Stalin. Okay, so we'll start today with Aron Trainin. Trainin, pictured here, who had a post at the Academy of Sciences Institute of Law in Moscow before it was evacuated for a time during the Second World War. From that post, Trainin served as an expert consultant to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He helped to shape a discussion in the Soviet Union and abroad about Nazi war crimes. Trainin's book, The Criminal Responsibility of the Hitlerites, which actually began as a report for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, it was published by the Soviet government in July 1944, and it would go on to provide a critical foundation for the IMT. It argued, among other things, that German leaders could and should be tried and punished for participating in a criminal conspiracy, and that the planning and waging of wars of aggression, wars of conquest, should be punished as crimes against peace. And Trainin actually coined this term. Trainin's book made its way across Europe to London, where it was discussed by the United Nations War Crimes Commission in October 1944. It then crossed the Atlantic to the United States, where it ultimately landed at the White House. In June of 1945, Soviet leaders sent Trainin to London to help negotiate the Nuremberg Charter, which set out the framework for the IMT. And here he is in the center with Yona Nikitchenko on his right, who would ultimately become the Soviet judge, who was supposed to become prosecutor first, and Trainovsky, the translator, on his Nikitchenko on his right, Trainovsky on his left. All right. Crimes against peace was included in the Charter's Article 6 as one of the three main categories of war crimes, along with war crimes and crimes against humanity. Stalin then made Trainin a member of the Soviet Union's secret commission and for the Nuremberg Trials, and sent him to Nuremberg to advise the Soviet delegation. And here is Trainin at the Nuremberg Trials, and in the corner, partly cut off, Soviet Chief Prosecutor Rudenko is at the same table with him. So what I want to ask now is, what kinds of experiences before the war shaped Trainin, shaped who he was, shaped his thinking about the law? Trainin was born in 1883 in the Pale of Settlement. He received his education and his most formative experiences, perhaps in that way, before 1917 in Imperial Russia, and in the 1910s and the 1920s in Berlin. Trainin spent decades crossing borders before World War II. In 1903, he began studying law at Moscow University, where he was exposed to a range of European legal ideas. In 1910 and 1913, he lived and studied in Berlin, associating with German criminologists like Franz von Liszt and Ernst Bieling. He visited Berlin again in 1925, and he actually wrote a book about the politicization of law in Weimar, Germany. After 1917, Trainin served the Bolshevik government. He became a law professor at Moscow University, and he got to know his colleague, Andrei Vyshinsky, whose own political career had already taken off. Their relationship would shape Trainin's career. It was only in 1935, after the Soviet Union joined the League of Nations, that Trainin invented himself as an international law expert. He did so at the urging of Vyshinsky, who had just become the Procurator General of the Soviet Union. Trainin wrote two books in the mid-1930s that attempted to define a Soviet approach to international law. The second of these books was called The Defense of Peace and Criminal Law. It was published in 1937, which just happened to be the height of the Stalinist terror. In this book, Trainin argued that the League of Nations had been so preoccupied with halting the spread of communism in the 1920s that it had ignored what he called now the real problem of preventing aggressive war. He complained that in current international law, and I'll quote him again here, unlawfully hunting rabbits is punished more severely than organizing the military destruction of people. Vyshinsky took some time out from prosecuting the Moscow trials in 1937 to sign on to Trainin's book as its editor, and actually wrote the introduction. So Nuremberg. Trainin was chosen for his role at Nuremberg in part because of his expert knowledge and because he talked the talk of European international law. Western lawyers saw him, and I'm quoting here, as an educated gentleman, and as a distinguished legal academician, and as an agreeable man to do business with. His input was critical to Nuremberg. Behind the scenes, he helped to formulate key legal arguments for Soviet judge Yona Nikitchenko. His ability, too, to connect with members of the Western delegation personally and in his writings helped Soviet ideas to receive a hearing. After Nuremberg, Trainin remained enthusiastic about the Soviet Union's continuing contribution to what everyone by this point was calling the progressive development of international law. He took his enthusiasm to Paris in October 1946, to the first meeting of the International Association of Democratic Lawyers, the IADL, which elected him one of its vice presidents. The IADL soon established status as the consultative body, a consultative body for the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations. Then in the late 1940s, during Stalin's anti-cosmopolitan campaign, Trainin's ties abroad became a liability. He was denounced, among other things, for cooperating with bourgeois jurists. Even as Trainin fell out of favor in the USSR, though, his concept of crimes against peace lived on and continued to shape discussions in the United Nations and in other organizations about international law. All right, I'm going to move on next to Vsevolod Vishnevsky. All right, so Vsevolod Vishnevsky, the Soviet playwright and the V or A star correspondent for the Soviet press at the Nuremberg Trials. There were a number of them, but he was one of the biggies. Vishnevsky wrote for the Soviet newspaper Pravda and for other publications like the magazine Znamya banner. At Nuremberg, from Nuremberg, he also broadcast live radio reports from inside the Palace of Justice. At Nuremberg, Vishnevsky also served as an informant, sending Moscow detailed reports about life in Nuremberg. Several months into the trials, he reported, and I'll quote him here, that homesickness is getting to everyone, and that while some members of the Soviet delegation were hanging on the telephone lines to Moscow, others were fraternizing with locals and had become obsessed with shopping on the black market. Vishnevsky also worked as an aide to the Soviet prosecution, compiling biographical information about the defendants and offering advice about how the prosecutors should prepare for various stages of the trials. And here he is, he's on the right, and Roman Rudenko, the Soviet chief prosecutor, is on the left, and they're talking with some other Soviet correspondents in the corridors in the middle of the trials. Okay, well, what were Vishnevsky's experiences before Nuremberg? Vishnevsky was born in 1900 in St. Petersburg to a family of hereditary nobles. He joined the Bolshevik Party at age 17 and reinvented himself as a revolutionary, serving as a machine gunner and a political agitator in Russia's Civil War. It was during the Civil War that he got his start as a playwright, staging mock trials, such as the trial of the Kronstadt mutineers. Like Trainin, Vishnevsky had spent time in Western Europe before the war, but in a different Europe. In 1936, Stalin had sent him to France and to Spain as a cultural representative of the anti-fascist Popular Front. Vishnevsky became well-known in leftist circles. In Paris, he rubbed elbows with James Joyce and Pablo Picasso. During World War II, Vishnevsky worked as a war correspondent. He remained in Leningrad during the blockade, writing for Pravda and broadcasting near-daily radio announcements. And then in the spring of 1945, he marched with the Red Army to Berlin. Vishnevsky was selected for Nuremberg because of his reputation at home and abroad as a writer and a member of the cultural elite. He mingled with Western correspondents at Nuremberg, and soon after arriving, he came to understand just how little they seemed to know and understand about the war in the East. He wrote home that people, I'm quoting here, stare wide-eyed when I tell them about Leningrad and Stalingrad. On their faces and in their souls, there are almost no traces of Russia's struggle. Vishnevsky was also disturbed by the flood of anti-Soviet articles that were appearing in the local German language newspapers, and he was concerned about Soviet shortcomings on the international stage. But here, at least, he thought that he could make a difference. At Nuremberg, Vishnevsky did what he could to set up a working public relations apparatus, and he did this before the Soviet prosecution presented its part of the case. In January 1945, he sent a memo to Rudenko, Soviet chief prosecutor, observing, and I'll quote him here, that the American, British, and French delegations had used a variety of public relations techniques to ensure positive coverage in the world press. He suggested that the Soviets do the same. His recommendations, which he listed out for Rudenko, included things like holding daily press briefings at the press camp and in English and in French, daily briefings at the press camp in English and in French, holding informal receptions to communicate with the press in what he calls, I'm quoting him here, in a more lively and spontaneous manner, and pre-circulating summaries of the Soviet prosecution speeches along with interesting evidence in advance. Here he reprimanded Rudenko for keeping Soviet evidence, and the phrase he used, he says, for keeping Soviet evidence under lock and key. And he urged him to share these materials more freely with the press, And he reminded Rudenko of the importance of international public opinion. And here I'll just say that in contrast to Misha's point about this, the Soviets, things working for them, right? Like Soviet practices working. In the Nuremberg case, the Soviet practices are not working for them. And they're trying to find other ways to communicate and actively on the ground borrowing from the other delegations. So, and I hope we'll come back to this in our discussion. In any case, many of Wisniewski's suggestions were adopted at Nuremberg. The Soviets did hold press conferences in the press camp and in the Palace of Justice. And immediately after Nuremberg, Soviet leaders even briefly discussed, and there are some really interesting documents on this, the possibility of learning from the Anglo-American model of public relations. The future looked bright for Wisniewski. In 1947, Soviet leaders enlisted him to participate in the Soviet Union's peace campaign. He joined other prominent Soviet cultural figures in signing a letter to American writers, asking them, and I'll quote here, to raise their voices against the new threat of fascism, reactionary forces in the West. But in 1948, Wisniewski too fell victim to Stalin's anti-cosmopolitan campaign. He was removed from his post as the editor of Znamya for continuing to publish Jewish writers. And 3 years later, he died. Okay, so that's a bit of Trainin, a bit of Wisniewski, and we'll move on, last but not least, to Roman Rudenko, the Soviet chief prosecutor in Nuremberg. And what I love about this particular slide is that he's actually giving a press conference in the Palace of Justice. So one of those smaller press conferences that Wisniewski suggested that they set up, here he is kind of doing his thing. And there are several photos like this, they're just great. All right, well, the summer before the Nuremberg trials, Roman Rudenko had been quite busy. While Aaron Trainin was helping to draft the framework of the IMT, Rudenko was prosecuting a major show trial in Moscow. This was the trial of the 16 leaders of the Polish underground state, of anti-Nazi resistance leaders who had been loyal to the London-based Polish government in exile. Staged in Moscow before a large audience that included Western diplomats and journalists, this trial, this show trial, had turned reality upside down. The defendants, after being kidnapped and tortured by Soviet security forces, had confessed to collaborating with Nazi Germany. From Stalin's perspective, the trial had gone off brilliantly. Rudenko had impressed everyone with his golden tongue. And Stalin decided at this point that Rudenko and not Nikitchenko would be the Soviet chief prosecutor at Nuremberg. And Nikitchenko, who was originally slated for that role, was moved to the judge's bench. Rudenko had a very different biography from Trainin and Wisniewski. He had no experience abroad prior to Nuremberg. Born in 1907 to a peasant family in a small Ukrainian village, he left school after 7th grade to work in a sugar factory. He joined the Communist Party at age 19 in 1926, just as Stalin was rising to power. In the mid-1930s, while Wisniewski was hanging out in Paris and Trainin was writing books, Rudenko was prosecuting a series of show trials in the Donbass region of Ukraine. This was the formative moment of his political education. Afterwards, the party took him to take a 2-year law course to get credentialed. During the war, Rudenko climbed up through the ranks, becoming the Procurator General of the Ukrainian Republic. Now, Rudenko was a powerful speaker and an expert in Soviet-style show trials, but he had a very limited knowledge of international politics and world history. In September 1945, Rudenko went to London to work with American, British, and French chief prosecutors on preparing the indictment for the IMT. And he went from there to Berlin and ultimately to Nuremberg. At Nuremberg, Rudenko gave the major speeches for the Soviet prosecution, and that part of things went off beautifully. But there were also areas where things did not quite go according to plan. Rudenko struggled during negotiations with the Western prosecutors. Unlike Trainin and Vishnevsky, he did not know any foreign languages and was completely dependent on translators and interpreters. Also, the Stalinist politics of secrecy also got in Rudenko's way. Soviet leaders initially didn't bother to give him crucial information about the history of Soviet-German relations. Rudenko also floundered during the defense case. Accustomed to show trials, he had no experience with the give and take of a real cross-examination. After Nuremberg, Rudenko returned to his post as the Procurator General of the Ukrainian Republic. And in 1949, when Trainin was being investigated during the anti-Cosmopolitan campaign, Soviet leaders sent Rudenko in Trainin's place to the annual meeting of the International Association of Democratic Lawyers, the IADL, which was held that year in Rome. Rudenko used the occasion to belligerently denounce NATO, which had just been established, as a violation of international agreements. The IADL, which by this point, by 1949, had a communist majority, greeted the speech with enthusiasm. And soon after this meeting, the United Nations actually revoked the status of the IADL as a consultative body of the Economic and Social Council. Rudenko had a very different fate as well from Trainin and Vishnevsky. He outlived Stalin, and in 1953, he became the Procurator General of the Soviet Union, occupying that post until his death in 1981. All right, so let's step back now, and I've introduced you a bit to Trainin and Vishnevsky and Rudenko, and I just want to think a little bit about what do these examples tell us, right? What do they tell us about Russia's worlds? What do they tell us about the Soviet Union on the international stage? First of all, they remind us not to overgeneralize. The work of international relations wasn't just carried out by institutions like the party or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It wasn't just carried out by leaders like Stalin and Molotov. It was carried out by people who came from different backgrounds and from different generations and who brought different life experiences with them abroad. Trainin and Vishnevsky had more in common with each other in some ways than Rudenko, right? It seems kind of obvious. Both knew foreign languages, both had spent time in Europe before Nuremberg, but they had experienced different Europes. It was one thing to live and study in Berlin in the 1910s and 1920s. It was another thing entirely to be in Paris and Madrid in the 1930s. Also, maybe even more importantly, Rudenko, Trainin, and Vishnevsky had a significant amount in common. The Stalinist terror and the show trials of the 1930s had been formative for all three of them, and for every single member of the Soviet Union's international relations apparatus in the 1940s, probably for every single Soviet citizen, really, if we're going to talk more generally too. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs had been completely decimated after the Stalinist terror. So had the Soviet cultural elite. Rudenko, Trainin, and Vishnevsky, they hadn't just survived, they had thrived. They were selected by Stalin and Vyshinsky for Nuremberg because of their talent and their ability, and also because of their complete loyalty. Now, loyalty, as we know, was not necessarily enough to ensure one's survival in Stalin's Soviet Union. For Trainin and Vishnevsky, the end of the road, or at least the end of their roles in international affairs, came in the late 1940s. Rudenko, on the other hand, publicly carried out the Soviet Union's campaign against the West. In 1960, Rudenko, he's pictured here in the middle, he's looking a little bit different by this point, in his role as Procurator General of the Soviet Union, prosecuted the American U-2 pilot, Francis Gary Powers, for trespassing into Soviet airspace. In his final speech before the court in Moscow, Rudenko attacked the US government, using Trainin's term, for organizing and inciting a monstrous crime against peace. All right, so a couple of very final thoughts before we move on to discussion. So I just want to say that through the example of Nuremberg, we see how the Soviet Union influenced the wider world. Trainin's arguments about Nazi criminal responsibility and crimes against peace, those are just one example. We also see how the wider world influenced the Soviet Union, prompting, in the case of Vishnevsky, for example, a recognition of certain Soviet shortcomings and for a short time, a rethinking of the Soviet Union's public relations apparatus. We also see, and I think this is really important here, and I think this is part of where I want to have this discussion with Misha about this. We see how certain Soviet ideas and practices actually emerged from a longer term engagement between Russia and Europe. Trainen's time in Berlin and his engagement with German jurists and European legal thought were absolutely critical to his formation. Soviet leaders claimed Trainin as Soviet when it was useful and enlisted him to help develop a field of Soviet international law. But they then cast him out as a cosmopolitan later, as new borders hardened between the Eastern Bloc and the West. Trainin hadn't changed. The times had. The Cold War brought a reconfiguring of Russia and its worlds. So thank you for your attention. And I'll stop sharing my screen, and I am looking forward to talking about all of this. If I can just get the, oops. Here we go. All right, I think, am I back? I'm back, yes. Awesome.
So thank you both for those fascinating talks. And now we'll turn to a discussion between the two of you and sort of overlaps between what you presented and your larger work and different resonances and anything that you'd like to discuss.
Okay, so I guess I should start then. I took down about 6 or 7 major points that I want, but I'm not going to be able to talk about them all because it would involve a whole other lecture, I think. But I just want to say for the record, Fran, we had a meeting beforehand where we sort of agreed on our game plan of talking about, at least I took away from that we should talk about biography. So this wasn't entirely accidental. And that leads me to my very first point, is why the interest in biographies that you and I are seeing, but it's clear that you're seeing it more generally in the Russian field, Soviet field, but also in the historical profession. One reason is that we're sort of people of our own times and we're become interested in what the trends are, perhaps, and I mentioned the question of sources. On the sort of potentially negative side of the ledger, I sometimes think it's because we need to sell books more and trade books, and people like biographical stories. So there's a kind of danger in talking too much about biographies when you don't connect the lives to the system or broader configurations, whether it be cultural or international history or whatever. Present company accepted, of course, we're both embedding these in much larger studies. But I do think that your point that this is all about people and that they're central to the story points to our growing interest in agency. And I think that this may be a sort of post-revisionist moment where through lives we can get at things like social backgrounds, groups, generations, broader bringing back sort of a social component that had long been kind of very politicized in our field, but through a more nuanced picture. When I look at individual lives, what I'm finding very interesting is that when you set them against these bigger backdrops, you can sometimes figure out where people had agency, but also when they didn't have agency. It's one thing to invoke agency in the abstract and another thing to actually investigate it. And a lot of times, as you saw in your 1948 moments, right, the turn of the wheel, people were powerless. So that's a second thing. We're both dealing to some degree with intellect. I'm dealing more with local, right, professionals, but still members of the intelligentsia, local elites. We're trained to think about knowledge and power, but also knowledge and powerlessness springs to my mind. So your story about third major point is the centrality of the terror for both of our stories. And maybe it's time to broaden the literature on the terror from the numbers game, from the questions of how the terror itself was experienced and how it was implemented, which have dominated the discussions of the terror, to how this cataclysm remained a touch point for the entire Soviet period, and especially for those groups that were hit disproportionately, which included all elites. And so you have to overcome, so the terror sort of, in my story, and I think in yours, in the case of Rudenko, it continues its long arm because people were shaped by it. You see that very clearly during especially the initial phase of the war. But you also had to overcome its legacy, and the war constitutes a kind of separate period in the immediate post-war period because of the wartime alliance with the Allies, because of the opening to the outside world. But then you get a turn of the wheel again with the post-war Zhdanov era crackdown. And so what we're looking at is cyclical development, and that's really part of both imperial and Soviet history, and I think it deserves more attention. The other question you raised about, pre-war pre-Soviet expertise and international sort of legacies inflecting Soviet era developments, it strikes me that the problem of generations here also is another one that hasn't been as explored as many other aspects of Soviet history. There have been, I won't go into the literature, but there's been only a few real explorations. So I'll stop there. That's plenty. I have several other points though, so we can pick them up in discussion, I think.
No, this is great. I'm not gonna be as coherent as 5 points, I think, but I think that what I'm just as you were giving your presentation, and then as I was talking, kind of making those connections, I think that there's so many issues just in terms of thinking about, again, this a comparison between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, but then are these cases that we're looking at, is there something unique, right? Is there something unique about what you're looking at? Because these actors, they grew up in the Soviet Union, they end up, in Menchaga's case, in Nazi Germany, right? Would someone who had grown up in different circumstances, like what would that comparison look like? Is it because of totalitarianism, or is it because of having lived through a certain kind of trauma and having survived that kind of trauma? Like, how do we make sense of that? So that was one of the things I was thinking about. And just also just this question of, it comes to that question of participation, collaboration, complicity. Like, what does it mean? Anybody who survived the 1930s or even earlier periods in the Soviet Union, right? You had to, how do we make sense of those people and those stories, right? How do we tell those stories, and how do we reckon? I guess, at the end of the day, I want to know, what do you think of Menchagan? Like, what do you think we should take away? How should we evaluate him? He thinks one thing about himself, and now people want to hold him up as a hero, and we see it's, we could say it's complicated, it's messy, but really, like, what do you think of him at the end of the day? Do you think that he's someone who did the best that he could in the circumstances that he found himself in? Do you think that, and why all the attention to him now, right? I mean, it's super interesting. But I'm wondering a little bit about that. And and just a question of biography, I think is again, it is really interesting. I mean, I think we're humans, right? We're interested in other people and other people's lives. The tricky thing that I think with looking at biographies in these kinds of cases, it's in some ways, it's a biography of a career, right? That we have certain amounts of information and certain amounts of knowledge, but when you study the Soviet Union versus maybe some other countries where there's much more, where it was just easier to get other kinds of sources, the information that we have, like, I know some about Trayanin's like personal life and family life and all of that, but I don't have like those personal papers. So in a way, we're calling this biography, but it's really more looking at people's professional lives and a little bit of their personal lives and what we can bring into that. And so I guess just to throw that out as a general question in terms of this interest in Soviet history and doing that, like, how do we as Soviet historians try to figure out ways to get the kinds of sources that might answer the kinds of questions that we still have. Like I still have so many questions, right, about Trainin and Rudenko, and even now that the book is done, I've been finding out more little bits and pieces, and you find some photos and family photos, and then you just wanted to know more because it's still very incomplete. Go ahead, your turn.
Well, I'm going to respond to that because it's very interesting that you raised the issue of personal lives. And I take your point that we have limited access, right, to people's inner thoughts, even to their family lives, things that are absolutely crucial to them as human beings. And so I take your point that we're looking at their public or professional lives. And but I want to tell you a little story. You asked about Menshagin. And first of all, the fact is that because a team of people were working on this with me, they uncovered things that I could have never uncovered alone, including all his petitions to Khrushchev, attempts to be rehabilitated, documents that showed that his memoirs were shaped by his legal experience of trying to get his sentence reduced post-Stalin, right? So the memoirs can't be understood without both his experience as a lawyer and also his hopes for getting out of prison. But also there's something that was very little known, and Pavel Palyan, the main figure behind the book, uncovered this when he was digging deeply into Menshagin's personal life, was that he made a decision in 1941 not to evacuate. So many people, and he would have been able to evacuate, but he presented in his memoirs as just accidental. You know, he happened to be made mayor. He happened to be on the spot. It wasn't at all. He made a deliberate decision, and you can do that by tracing his movements as the Germans approached. And one thing that he had done in the pre-war period was that he had a wife, but he was religious, but he also had had committed the sin of having a second wife and even a child with that second wife who was born shortly after the war. Now, you know, he never spoke about this at all. He never spoke about the out of wedlock child, except he mentioned her, but he never focused on it, and it was sort of suppressed. But when you look at it, was his decision to remain when the Soviets departed a desire? You know, he split up with his first wife at that point, and then started living with his second wife. And that went along with this huge political. And
Dr. Zhivago all over again. I mean, that's incredible. Yeah.
You asked for I just taught a course on Dr. Zhivago.
No, I mean, just Dr. like with the staying behind and what drives someone, like the personal choice versus the political choice. I mean, that's
absolutely, but he's no Zhivago. And so you've asked for a reaction. And I am much more skeptical because I believe that first of all, it's not my job to be the hanging judge. And so people want to find someone who was anti-Stalinist, or, you know, someone he was always a Russian. So he wasn't a nationalist in that he wasn't political in that sense, but he thought that Russia could gain an autonomy within the German Reich. So he sort of fundamentally misread Nazism. And that answers your other question in part, is that the experience of Stalinism, right, it destroyed solidarities that existed in other countries. So when faced with the German onslaught, people had to make new solidarities, or they were very fragmented. They had just their close friends and colleagues to make these lasting decisions. And when you see, for example, the Jews that came in from the West were used to organizing and doing political things. In the Soviet Union, there was the saying, you know, no initiative goes unpunished. And so they had to relearn a lot of things during the war. So I think that the experience, you know, of Stalinism in the 30s, you know, was directly, you know, cast a light, not just on people's knowledge of the outside world and expertise, but on their whole attitude towards the state. Now, you know, Menshagin and others, they thought they understood the Germans very well because they thought they were just sort of would get away with the same kinds of things and that they got away with under Stalinism. And sometimes they got away with much more because the Germans were very impressed by, say, just a piece of paper. And he writes about this quite openly. He would stamp up a piece of paper saying order in German, and the Germans would stay away from his building because they had this exaggerated respect for authority. But where he misread it was that they did, the extent to which they would devastate, the violence that they would go through, the genocidal impulse. And his whole future fate was caught up with that misreading.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's fascinating. It's really interesting.
For you then, do you see the personal lives of any of your three figures coming in any similar way? Where I talked about his, second wife, that's a key moment where the personal life intersects with a major political decision, Is there anything that you have?
I think that one of the things that I've thought a lot about while working on the book, a number of the members of the Soviet delegation were Jewish, and a number of them had lost family, right, with the invasion, and yet they're also Soviet, and so they identify themselves as Soviet, and that's kind of the main. So Chayinin, for example, right, he was from the Pale of Settlement. I don't have a lot of details, but there are some details about like family and friends that had perished, and then right, so it's more for me because I don't have those personal papers. Oh gosh, it would be amazing to get them one day. But it's more just a set of questions that I think about as I'm working on it and trying to understand, like, again, when did someone grow up? Like, who were they? What was their family experience like? What were the choices? What did they bring? Again, it's that question of what did they bring with them? But I don't have a story like a second wife in that. That's very, 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 very interesting.
Well, and the Minsk Commission also provides sort of at least people's own words and reflections on their lives. But I have another question that has to do with our common theme. You're the expert and I'm the dilettante here, but the legal history aspect. Because to study Menshagin, I had to study his role in the local show trials and in the legal system. And I learned a lot about the legal system as it was on the local level. But his intersection with Vyshinsky, he actually goes to the main procuracy building on Ulica Gertsina or whatever it was, right in central Moscow, and has his audience. And Vyshinsky sends a telegram. So we know that he did this and that he changed the course of one local show trial. But what I got about Vyshinsky, who also came into your story, was that he had been a long-standing advocate of legal professionalism, who also, during the terror especially, had to play this major role and did play this major role in using terror. So the legal system as sort of system of a tool for the regime had to be sort of well-functioning and well-executed, but it also had to be political. And so he tried to balance those two, and those things kind of sort of came in and out of the balance shifted, of course, greatly.
I think for Vyshinsky, those things went together, because remember, Vyshinsky kind of rose up in part. Before him, there was that whole movement for revolutionary legality, the whole Evgeny Pashtukhanis, so a whole denial of the importance of law. And so part of what Vyshinsky comes in is he really reintroduces the legal system, I think in part because, again, I get this the joining of the League of Nations, the Soviet Union on the international stage, the need for, Vyshinsky also will become deputy foreign minister. So that's the angle that he's coming at this with. A lot of it is about how the Soviet Union is then going to look to the external world in terms of thinking about law. But this question of he had to do the show, I don't know. I guess it was his job, but again, that is that question of like, how do we think about someone's role, right, that they play?
Yeah, that was not the best formulation.
No. But I think about that too, because I think about it in terms of Aaron Chayinin, who again, I would say when I first started working on this project, I was kind of pretty sympathetic to Chayinin because, he talks the talk of Western law. You read his books and they're just, he reads lots of languages and he's engaging with all these legal scholars and it's really interesting to read, right? It's great reading. But then, as I got to worked on this more, I realized that it's not, so Vyshinsky's running the show trials, but Trainin is actually writing books then about complicity that takes some of Vyshinsky's ideas that he had elaborated in the show trials in order to justify the prosecution of people as a group, right, of the old Bolsheviks as a group, that train, and then it becomes law, like justified as law, right, in some of his writings afterwards. So it's not, so it all goes together, right? It's not, training is implicated in that whole system. They all are. And that kind of, to me, that gets to that question of, again, so what do we make of it? It's because, again, I appreciate the not wanting to stand back and to be the hangman or the judge ourselves, because this isn't our lives. These aren't our choices, right? That we're not the ones who are trying to survive this particular system. But yet, as historians, we do have to make some judgments, right, about the people that we're studying, about, you raised the question of morality, I think, when you were talking about Meshuggah and him thinking of himself as being more, that raises all kinds of questions, right? What do you do with that as a historian when someone talks
so
about
you're pressing me on this, and I will lay my cards completely out on the table then. I don't shy away from using the word collaborator. Mm-hmm. And to me, he made a fateful decision by going along with the Nazis. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that led him down a certain path. So there was a kind of path dependency. And at each, he had to, and the same was for partisans, for example, who were former communists in the countryside. They would have been denounced as communists. There was not very many places for them to go. The partisans were a safe haven if they didn't want to be destroyed, in the occupied countryside. So there are limited agency, right? There's limited choices. But once there are turning points in people's lives. And 41, the decision for him to stay was of such a turning point. And it led him down a certain path where he couldn't turn back and got increasingly implicated. So that's one aspect. And then he had to, do all sorts of things because he was enmeshed in the relationship with the Germans. He became mayor. He evacuated with them. He was a mayor of Bobruisk. He was, et cetera, et cetera. But the other thing is that I tried to make the point that by subordinating himself, he got greater local power. And that's where my argument about levels of power comes, but I'm not sure it has relevance for your topic. One point that I did want to ask about, which has to do with Stalinism in the 30s and then the wartime trials, is, or the post-war trials, has to do with the defense prosecutors, because that was always weak in the defense attorneys in the Soviet system. That's the role Meshuggah played, right? It was greatly weakened. But it's what if we think of another theme as one of cross-cultural encounter, that the war suddenly opens up new international contacts, and then especially the post-war emergence of the Soviet Union in Europe, right? I wonder how it played out in Nuremberg, but I guess I have to read your book, which I'm using in my fall class, by the way.
That's great.
Yeah, but it's an interesting point, is how much the pre-war legal system, right? His role, in my view, Meshuggah was subordinated already by that role. It was what he was able to find. They needed people to play that role to give it the sort of appearance of legality, but it was very unusual for the defense attorney to seriously push back, and they were often demeaned by the local judges, right, even during the era of collectivization, which was his first experience. I read
I'll just make a pitch for Matthew Renzel's book on revolutionary courts, where he actually talks about the history of the defense attorney in Russia. And it's super interesting that the defense attorneys would often find themselves in serious trouble, because it was a very delicate position. So, but he goes into a lot of detail on it in the earlier period.
Should we, I have other points to make, but what do you think, Sam? Should we start picking up questions?
You can open it up and then we can come back and
I think we're going to hear a couple of questions from the audience. Thank you very much. The first question we have is from David Tra. I think it's to Michael. Did the Nazi occupation bring out any white or other truly anti-Soviet elements in the Smallansk area?
Well, it depends what you mean by white. So for me, I would, it's sometimes used very loosely to a white emigration. To me, whites mean the white movement in the Civil War, right? And there was an emigration after the Civil War that many of these people followed the Wehrmacht in their sort of tail to return both to all areas. So most importantly for me, the white Russian, I'm not sorry, I meant to say Belarusian, Belarusian emigres who had an agenda for creating a greater Belarus were one important element in the wartime occupation because they saw the Smallansk area peasantry as ethnographically Belarusian, and this was, so Minshagin as the ethnic Russian clashed with such people. So there were these internecine conflicts. That's a big part of my story. But there were other Russian, ethnically Russian emigres, most particularly NTS, the National Labor Union, through the Voice Soyuz. The younger generation had not, didn't come out of the pre-17, but they had grown up in emigration, and they came back and infiltrated many, many local governances throughout the occupied territories. Very important and little, there's more to be done on this story. But in terms of the sort of Soviet population, and you asked about anti-Soviet, right? The peasantry was a big factor here. Collectivization and the fact that the peasantry really saw this as an opportunity to come to some sort of new rural order. And there was spontaneous decollectivization in some, rather, not all areas, but in the areas that I'm talking about, which was Dorogobuj and Yanya, there was an spontaneous decollectivization that the Germans then had to sort of counter because it wasn't in the interests of their requisitioning. But the peasantry was very reactive to the closeness of the front lines and the specter of re-Sovietization. So, it's a very, very complicated question. But when the Germans come in, many rural populations welcome them with bread and salt. They want to cooperate, and they gradually learn a lot more about the Germans, the brutality of the rule, both in, all sorts of ways. So in the course of that 1 year, if the Nazi German occupation had been somewhat, this was a question posed long ago by Alexander Dahlen, if it had been somewhat different, it could have, changed that whole dynamic. But there were still many members of the local clergy, many peasants who were essentially not, what you might call, if you want to use that term, anti-Soviet. In terms of other groups, there's a whole book I would just recommend by Oleg Budnitsky, co-edited it, called Ideyny Collaborationism, which has to do with ideological collaboration. That collaboration was not ideological in the sense of being pro-Nazi or pro-fascist in any ideological sense. The ideology there was that it was anti-Soviet and anti-Stalinist. This is a fairly small minority of openly ideological, sort of anti-Soviet people who, for those reasons, directly welcome the Germans. I could go on, but that's the short answer.
Okay, thank you. The next question comes from Yanis Tsirigakis. How did, and I guess it might well work for both of you, how did the successful pinning of the USSR crimes like cutting to the Germans or sidelining discussion of the USSR Nazi-like Holocausts, like the Holodomor in Ukraine, embolden the culture of cover-ups of repression, but also an inverted interpretation of history and rhetoric, as the example you mentioned about using Nuremberg language against Western adversaries?
So I'll just come in with this.
Yeah,
and thinking about Katyn. So the interesting thing about the Nuremberg trials with Katyn is there is an effort to pin Katyn decisively on the Germans, and it fails. So the Soviets do manage to get Katyn into the Indictment Act, much to the horror later of the Westerners once more evidence surfaces after the Indictment Act is published that they have the Western leaders have some evidence, but in terms of the Western prosecutors get more evidence after it's in there. But what happens is that the defense petitions for witnesses, and ultimately there are 3 German defense witnesses that are heard, including Basilevsky, and 3 Soviet witnesses that are heard. I mean, inverted. So Basilevsky, Soviet. So 3 defense witnesses, 3 Soviet witnesses, and it's pretty much declared to be a kind of a draw in the sense that so the Soviets are not tried for the crime, but the sense is that the German witnesses have presented enough questions about it and the Soviets are unable to undo that it basically disappears. It just doesn't appear in the judgment. And again, this is one of those areas where like there's still work to be done, because I wonder, like, is there some discussion behind the scenes? But all we know right now is that it disappears. It's not included. So in the end, it doesn't, for the Soviets, it's sort of a loss, right? Because they wanted to use Nuremberg to decisively pin Katyn on the Germans, and they're not able to do so. But in terms of the Western powers can feel sort of okay about it, that in the end, that's not what happened. I'll throw the ball to Misha to add on.
Well, I'll just say that, I've obviously visited Katyn. It's outside of Smallansk, and seen the museum there, and it's not, it comes in with Menshagin. It's not, it'll come into my book probably at several points. It's not a major source of my own investigation, but the fact that it was discovered by the Germans, right? And then, so the Germans were propagating the world's knowledge about it. This is something that has muddied the waters somewhat and has never been really fully, in my mind, investigated. There was a Swedish historian, I think Samuelson, who was going to start investigating that. But just the very fact that there were many killing sites of the Polish officers, not just near Smallansk, and how it was named and associated with that one place, was probably flowed from the way it was uncovered. And now in Russia, the Military Historical Society seems to be making a big deal to cast kind of doubt that this was shaped by German propaganda, and just sort of omitting all the documents that came out starting in the 90s that were sort of with Beria and Stalin and so forth, that to take the investigation off the Soviet side. But there is a German side to be investigated on it. And the other thing is that it implicated the work of the ČVK, the Extraordinary Soviet Commission on Nazi Crimes, because that was a special operation where the NKVD came in, and for many, many years, people cast doubt on the veracity of the Soviet war crimes materials, which is absolutely central for anyone studying the Holocaust. And so just a shout out to my PhD student, Paula Chan, who's completing a dissertation on this. But the commission had many phases of its work and many levels of its operations. And so looking at it in one place, at any one place, is how people have done it, because the way we've looked at things, so we studied one site. It's one reason I want to get into a region rather than just a city or a single place. And it's an amorphous region because Smolensk's boundaries changed greatly in the 20s and 30s as well, but it's a sort of Western Russian Federation area. But you get at a regional location, but you're not just looking at one element there. And so I think that's another thing we have to consider, how it cast it sort of implicated Soviet evidence on German war crimes for many decades.
Yeah, it's amazing to me still that this is that after evidence has, I mean, so right, so even in secret protocols, that there's evidence there was so much evidence at Nuremberg about the secret protocols, and so much evidence afterwards, and yet there's still these efforts to throw that into question, which is sort of astounding. I wanted to just to quickly address the second part of the question too, in terms of the language of Nuremberg and how that got used, because the language of Nuremberg, crimes against peace, crimes against humanity, the term genocide, this became fundamental to the Nuremberg principles, right, which the United Nations discussed and ratified to some degree, but it never fully made it into international law until much later. But part of what happened almost immediately is that all of that language became politicized and used by during the Cold War countries to kind of take each other to task for things. But it also became politicized and used, though I would say that dissident groups use that language of crimes against humanity and genocide to argue for rights, and civil rights organizations in the West use that language as well. So when we can talk about the politicization of this language, and it's not always like a negative thing, right? But that language itself was very powerful and was used to all kinds of ends afterwards.
Okay, thank you, Fran and Michael. So, the next question comes from Lavinia Popica. I'm sorry if I mispronounce it. Can you develop more about Soviet PR versus Western PR and mutual influence, propaganda versus PR?
So just a clarification. PR to me means public relations. That was a kind of discipline developed in the 1920s, which could be seen as related to propaganda. But what is the distinction that you are interested in here? To answer that question, I need to sort of know what, I mean, if you're meaning about like more propaganda in the direct sense of attempts to mold opinion on a mass scale versus more sort of soft power influences like cultural diplomacy and so forth. Is that what the distinction we're getting at?
So I'll try to take it from another end, and maybe so I guess in terms of in my work, part of what I was thinking about also, so the Soviets were obviously very skilled at what we tend to think of as propaganda, especially domestically, in terms of controlling the narrative about things. So, if you read Pravda, you read other newspapers, there's a clear narrative. Things are censored or self-censored at a certain point, right? But part of what happens in Nuremberg, they're still good at that. So the Soviets are able to craft a narrative about the trials and a story about the trials, including what they want to include and not including what they don't want to include. So they absolutely have that down. But one of the things that they struggle with more at Nuremberg is what I talk about is international public relations. And that's something that I understand to be broader. That includes things like being able to, again, convey your story to the Western media, right, more productively by doing the things that Wisniewski was recommending, like holding press conferences and certain kinds of meetings. It also, when they talk about this public relations in correspondence about this at Nuremberg, and some of the complaints that come home about why the Soviets are not doing very well at this is because the Western powers, they've set up movie theaters and they show all of their movies there. And they say, why aren't we doing that as well, right? That this is a great opportunity to showcase like what's great about our country. And so that's, again, part of my understanding. And when they get to Nuremberg, they see all these things that the Americans in particular are doing that are really, they see it that they're really effective in terms of, again, letting the Americans control more of the story of things. And so that's something that Wisniewski like wants the Soviets to get better at.
Okay, I can take a crack at it now. Thanks, Sam, for both sides, German and Soviet, blanketed the Smallansk area with propaganda. And in some ways, the Germans had a better sort of printing operation. One of the most interesting aspects is you see both sides commenting on one another. And I actually had a whole chapter planned on propaganda information. And it's so hard to, well, one thing I would say, we asked the question was, how does Soviet differ? Well, on the Soviet side, half the people believe their own propaganda, and it fundamentally shapes the way, for example, they are reporting on the occupied territories. Whereas others, you see, informational reports at quite a high level being written that are not in line with Soviet propaganda, but where they end up in this system that is just churning this stuff out on all levels, they can just get ignored completely, depending on what context it is. So I think the Soviet system, in wartime, and your question was about Western, but German is not exactly, I don't know, Nazi Germany Western or not, but it was a different country and a different, approach. But the Germans had this notion of the propaganda of the deed, which actions speak louder than words, but they still thought, well, we might as well blanket the entire thing with propaganda anyway. I think both sides, having been inured to propaganda, it's very difficult to judge how much effect this actually had, but I think that it was probably pretty much ignored to a great degree on the ground on both sides. But both sides had learned the lesson of total war to mean that they could not just not do this, right? So those are just some thoughts on this. The other question aspect that Fran touched upon is sort of it has to do with the relative isolationism of the Stalinist Soviet Union and the relative inexperience of a lot of people, especially the purge generation, having experience with the outside world. And that whole theme in your talk, I think, is very, much part of Soviet history, in that there's a certain level where they project what they know from their own system on these novel circumstances and have to make real adjustments. So how people, you saw this in Soviet cultural diplomacy going back to the 20s, where there are these horrific translations. They didn't know how to make arguments that would be effective abroad, but the internal pressures were such that there was very little room for them to just take advice from outsiders and open it up and change their methods.
I think I'm going to go with the next question, and it's going to be to Fran. So I haven't read the book closely, but what I feel like the Soviet legal scholars, including Trainin and Wyszyński, they somehow engaged with an experience of previous trials, in particular Istanbul trial of 1920. So can you elaborate a little more on that? So how did they reflect on this experience, and were there any Soviet publications by Soviet legal scholars about this trial in the interwar period?
So about the Istanbul trial?
Yeah.
So I haven't seen discussion or talk about that in terms of what they're looking at and what they're thinking about. So in terms of, again, from my sense is for the Nuremberg trials, I think it's very instructive that all of the members of the Soviet delegation, so Trainin he's a consultant. He's not a member of the prosecution. He's not a judge. But all of the members of the prosecution, they have some kind of show trial experience. So I think it's key that Rudenko is chosen for that role, and then the others have that kind of experience as well. And that Yona Nikochenko, the judge, had been a judge in the show trials. So again, my sense is when they're thinking about Nuremberg, they really think that the Nuremberg trials are going to be open and shut. They take Nazi guilt as a given. Like there's no question. And it just seems like obvious, right? And in fact, the British initially hadn't even, they didn't want a trial. They thought, we'll just deal with this by executive decree. If the Soviets pushed for a trial, and the Americans eventually got on board for a trial as well, for different reasons. And so that's part of why the Soviets end up being, I think, at such a disadvantage, because they don't understand at the beginning what this is going to look like, how the defense case is going to run, the rights that will be given to the defendants, for example. So that's part of what they're up against. And remember, it's not just so it's, Wyszynski himself. So it's the Shakhty trial, it's the Industrial Party affair trial, it's the Moscow trials. But then, we also have to think about Soviet war crimes trials, like the Krakow trial. Because, once again, in those trials, the Soviets were very much controlling the narrative. They were controlling the script. And that's what they thought. They thought, again, that the prosecutors would be controlling the script. And I'll just say, too, that there was reason for them to think that, in the sense that the Nuremberg Charter, it limits the trial to the prosecution of Axis crimes, right? So that's part of why, even had there been a desire among the Western prosecutors to have a full airing of Katyn, right? That wasn't going to happen, because this was not supposed to be examining Axis allied crimes. And even from the start, the prosecutors had all agreed to try to keep difficult, uncomfortable things out of the courtroom. So those are I think that's more of the model that the Soviets are looking at. The Western powers, on the other hand, they're looking at some earlier trials, and they're looking at some of the trials after World War II, after World War I, and that's part of why they don't think there should be a Nuremberg, because they think that the earlier trials after World War I were a disaster. And that, why would you want to do that again? But that's, in fact, Aaron Chainin, when he writes about why there should be a trial, he says that the Western powers are being very short-sighted in using those earlier trials as an example, that this is what Nuremberg is going to be like. It's not Nuremberg yet, but this isn't what a reckoning of that sort would be like. So yeah, so different.
Can I add just one point on this
go
as
ahead,
a
Misha,
footnote?
please.
So when I was examining the local show trials, the regional show trials and local ones in the 30s, one thing that really struck me was that in 37, the local ones were organized by direct intervention from the very top by Stalin, and they were seen as a crucial component of the terror. But the word that was used was mobilization. This was seen as a form of mass mobilization because it mobilized local opinion, and it was one of the many components that had to accompany the terror. And so, when you think about the role of the question, I'm still answering the question before on propaganda in a way, but the Soviets thought of propaganda coming out of their total war mass mobilizing experience. And this was something that very much shaped their understanding of propaganda. And I think when you look at the history of propaganda, it has a lot to do with like other forms of molding opinion or diplomacy and cultural diplomacy. They're all shaped by the internal domestic orders which create them. So mass mobilization was extraordinarily overt. You mobilized opinion. And when you think about how this influenced Nuremberg, it's sort of interesting how the Soviet sort of alternative modernity came back to sort of influence global developments in that sort of interesting backdoor way, right? In the sense that trials were held, right? And they now are seen as an important thing that affecting public opinion in terms of human rights, right? Yeah. So, so it's not the Soviet influence alone, but in the way it met other trends.
Right. No, absolutely.
Sam, go ahead.
Yeah, so I have a question, and I think we're nearly out of time, even our extended time, and so I'm going to use my privilege as moderator to ask not the last word, but the last question. And I think when we sort of envisioned this talk, we were thinking about the collision between the Soviet system and Nazi occupation, or the Soviet system and an Anglo-American international legal system, and also thinking about the Second World War as one of Russia's worlds unto itself, as a world sort of that creates its own terms of interaction. But I think what both of your talks have shown is that we're dealing here, even if we view it in that way, with multiple worlds or multiple temporal contexts that also come to influence these interactions. we've talked about the lives of some of these figures in interwar Europe, in Paris and Berlin, their lives in the pre-revolutionary Russian Empire. So there are these other contexts that come in. And I think my question actually kind of relates to the question about anti-Soviet sentiment in the occupied areas and the white movement. Is that so? We've talked about the Soviet system and a Nazi system, but are there efforts to reimpose or recreate sort of other worlds in the context of the war that are neither, that are either pre-revolutionary Russian or have some other idea about Russia? And you mentioned Vlasov, and also mentioned sort of several people who misread the Nazi project. And I was just thinking about other figures in the white emigration, like Krasnov, for example, who comes to fight for the Nazis, but has a vision of a restored Russian Empire or Russian state, but then also comes into conflict with the other Cossack representatives who are made to work for the Nazis, because he doesn't see the necessity of creating a separate Cossack state, whereas the Nazis are interested in doing that. So there are these competing worlds that are being instituted within the space of the war and after. And I wonder if both of you could talk about sort of other visions of order or visions of Russia that get created in this space.
Shall I take a first crack at that? First of all, what you said initially about Russia's worlds, I do think, we've been stressing pre-war, wartime, and post-war trajectories, but what I said about the partisans, that really was a unique wartime phenomenon, this Stalinism without Stalin, and there were many others. So the war we're sort of going beyond the traditionally constituted sense that this is a distinct period. And I think that when you're going through all these subperiods and all these phases, and I think of it as a long life cycle of revolutions, but if you just look at it, the transition from one distinct subperiod to another, those moments of transition are among the most interesting in Soviet history. So I think there's a lot to do to open up the war, which is, first of all, wasn't really studied by Soviet historians much at all before 2000, and now is studied very intensively on its own to do that. What we're doing, see it as a distinct subperiod, but also in connection with its other. So that's one point. Second thing I would say about Russia's worlds has to do with cross-cultural encounters. And I dearly wanted to include a third biographical example. I wasn't as successful as Fran. I only got to two because Menshagin is such an intricate case, But there was a Komsomol woman who spoke German, who wrote reports about German culture and sexual violence and sexual relations. And young women were among the large component, and both from the Soviet agents coming in and in the local population, which was obviously deprived of adult men, fighting age men. So the cultural apprehension of Germans, albeit Nazi Germans, so it's both the ideological and the cultural mixed in, I think is a major component of what people experienced in the occupied territories. And we've thought of the World War II as a war of annihilation, as absolute war, all sorts of things, total war, but not as a cross-cultural encounter. And I think that's something other people are beginning to explore. And I'm certainly, it's very much part of my agenda. So in terms of what you said about Russia, there were actually landlords from pre-1917 who attempted to reestablish their states under German occupied territory. I had a list of something like 20 something of these people in the Smallansk region. And I just really have been trying to track them down. And I have a few random examples of people talking about them. And sometimes they were able to reestablish kind of property rights. So this is an extreme example. It didn't happen very much, but there were some of those. But some people like Vlasov and the others who really, used the language of Russian nationalism were also very much Soviet products, I think. And so there was a kind of movement in the occupied ethnically Russian territories, including Smolensk, where they wanted to come to a new position for Russia within a greater German Reich, where they would have more autonomy. And many Nazis and many Wehrmacht official generals and others, high-level figures, recognized that making concessions to that would help them in a longer-term occupation. But Hitler was never willing to countenance any. And so in this sense, it was like what Michael Mann talked about long ago, regimes of permanent revolution that only make temporary compromises with groups and institutions. I think he was onto something when talking about both Stalinism and Nazism. Let's see, what else could one say? So there is an agenda of a kind of Russian national entity that might be formed, but was sort of quashed down by the Nazi inability to allow for any significant, even rhetorical autonomy. And to do otherwise, that's the question Dahlen once raised in his book. It's well worth rereading. In 1958, it's quite amazing. And it's out of date in some respects because he relied on a lot of emigre sources that are self-serving. But he posed the question, could they have acted otherwise? And otherwise, they wouldn't have been Nazis, right? So they were constrained, but especially the role of Hitler in all of this is really significant. And I would only add that my 1930s generation Komsomolka, who for her, the values of women in the professions, of culturedness, meaning a certain type of modern urban behavior, which the Germans showed by their brutality and sort of violence and boorishness and just, violation of all norms, that they were not the traditional hierarchy of Europe, and Russia, Soviet Union was wrong. It allowed her to assert Soviet superiority, if only cultural, even under occupation, the shame of that and the shame of domination, right? She was in for a big surprise because some of the people like who became later this kind of post-war Shelepin, who was head of the Komsomol, became later head of the KGB, but part of this Zhdanov era younger generation that incorporated strong elements of Russian nationalism and anti-Semitism during the anti-cosmopolitan campaign, completely turned on its head everything that she thought was Soviet. So the ground was really shifting under her feet.
See, we're just about out of time, but I've just like two very small things just to kind of add that I think for a future discussion, maybe for general. But when you're thinking about, again, the microcosm, right? So if these partisan camps were a microcosm, like outside of the Soviet world, Nuremberg in some ways was as well, right? Because there is this moment after the war in this city where there are these people from everywhere kind of mixing together. And that's, for me, that's one of the things that's really interesting about it. It is a different world and a different moment. And I think in terms of thinking about comparisons between what I looked at and what Misha looked at, again, when certain things that you bring with you from the Soviet Union, right? Like what works in what context, right? So certain things being effective in a partisan camp, but not working, right? In the case of when you're dealing with this international stage. The other thing in Russia's world, I mean, this is the moment of reimagining what Germany is going to look like. This is the moment of reimagining like all of the borders of Europe. This is a whole moment of recreation, right, of Russia's world. So I think if we think about it that way, and what Nuremberg was about and what that whole post-war moment was about, that's all part of it, those larger politics. The Nuremberg Trials were, as much as anything else, about imagining what that post-war future is going to look like. And that post-war future, including a possible socialist bloc. So, so thank you. And I guess 3:05, wow, we really, we really used up that time today.
It flew by, so thank you very much for the great conversation.
This is really fun.
Thank you.
Likewise,
Thank you.
thanks to both of you, and again to the Harriman and Carly for helping facilitate this. And thanks to everyone who attended. And again, thanks for a great conversation.
Thank you for the invitation. And Misha, thank you. This was really great to talk about all of this.
Goodbye.